All right, let's talk more about this abomination of desolation that Jesus referred to in Matthew 24 and takes us back to Daniel chapter 9 and other passages out of Daniel. The abomination of desolation apparently is going to involve the stopping of the sacrifices. So if we're going to take this literally, that means that the sacrifices must be reinstituted because they're not occurring today. And they must be reinstituted at some point before the Antichrist, the prince who is to come, can stop them when he enters into the temple and sets up the abomination of desolation. So keep these little clues in mind. So again, if this is true and this is the proper interpretation of this and we can apply these literal hermeneutics, then it likely requires the building of a third temple. And plans are already underway for that to happen in Jerusalem. I would encourage you to keep a close watch on the events in Jerusalem regarding the building of the third temple. There are plans already there to bring this about. So let's look at Daniel chapter 11. In fact, by the way, if you ever get a chance to go to Jerusalem, I would encourage you not only to go to the Temple Mount, but also to go further south into the city of David and those around down there, and go into the Old City and visit the Temple Institute. And there you'll see many of the implements that they've already fashioned, and you can learn a lot more about their plans to rebuild this third temple. The first temple was Solomon's temple, the second temple built by Zerubbabel, but reinforced and remodeled by King Herod, so it's often referred to as Herod's temple or the second temple. That was the one that was destroyed in AD 70. That is the temple that was in existence during Jesus' day on planet Earth, and that's the one that he and his disciples were referring to when his disciples said, look at all these buildings, and he says, I'll tell you, not one stone be left upon another, and he pronounced that prophecy that was fulfilled just a few decades later in 70 AD when Titus came in with the Syrian legions of the Roman army and wiped it out, just took everything down. The entire city was razed, men, women, and children were massacred, and the temple was taken down stone by stone. All right, let's look at Daniel chapter 11. Forces from him will arise, again, the prince who is to come, desecrate the sanctuary fortress. Well, oftentimes in the Old Testament, the temple is referred to as a sanctuary. Desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. So this seems to be a parallel prophecy. We got one version of it in Daniel 9, and now we got another version of it in Daniel 11. It's the same human writer, Daniel, but it's also the same prophecy with some additional details attached to it. The preterist view. Remember, the preterist view is the view of Revelation, the view of end-time events that says all this stuff has happened in our past. It might have been in the future when it was originally prophesied, but is now in our past. And they often refer to as to 70 AD or some other event where many of these prophesied occurrences, prophesied events occurred already in our past. So that's the preterist view. That is not the view I'm approaching our study from. I'm approaching our view from a futurist view that many of these events that are prophesied in the book of Revelation are yet in our future, largely occurring during that 70th week of Daniel, that last 7 years. All right, so there's a couple, if you're going to take the preterist view, there's a couple of candidates for things that happened in the past that might qualify to be considered an abomination of desolation. In 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple by erecting an altar to Zeus in the holy place, sacrificed a pig on it, and he did in fact stop the regular sacrifices. Now that sounds an awful lot like an abomination of desolation, and I think it probably is a good candidate for one, but Jesus is talking about something in the future in Matthew 24. Both of these events, Antiochus doing what he did in 167 BC, that would have been in Daniel's future, but it would have been in Jesus' past. So Jesus is talking about some future event. He's telling his followers, his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, that's the trigger of this period known as the Great Tribulation. So all this is in Jesus' future. So here we are around 30 AD approximately. 32 AD, and Jesus is talking about things yet future. So 70 AD would have been in his future, although it is in our past. But let's take a look at this one first with Antiochus. Now, just as a side note, the rededication of the temple after Antiochus desecrated it is the reason that the Jews celebrate Hanukkah. Did you know that? That is the event from 167 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes slaughtered the pig there. It had to be rededicated, and that is the lamp oil didn't give out, and that is why the Jews celebrate Hanukkah every year, is in commemoration of the reestablishment, rededication of the temple in that time frame. Now, Antiochus, although a great candidate for an abomination of desolation, and he was, and he did, but he doesn't fulfill all of the prophecy in Daniel 9. For example, he doesn't fulfill the making of the covenant. As far as we know, doesn't seem to fit in Antiochus's reign here. And I always think it's interesting. I don't know if it's worth making anything out of or not, just an observation. The name Antiochus, how close that is to the name Antichrist. It has some similar meanings in the Greek. So he could very well be a type. I think he is a type. He's a type of the abomination of desolation. And the archetype, the completion of that, the one that will be the final desecration, that will be at the hands of the Antichrist, for whatever that's worth. The Holy Spirit does play around with words and have puns quite a bit throughout Scripture, and it's fun to look for them. Whether that's one or not, I don't know, but I think it's interesting. Now, in 70 A.D., Titus, we talked about him, razed Jerusalem. He destroyed the temple, and he set up a temple to Jupiter, or the Greek version would be Zeus, in the place where the temple was after he destroyed it. And so this doesn't quite seem to fit the profile of the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about, because Titus set up his abomination, that temple to Jupiter, at the place where the holy place was, but it was after the temple was destroyed. And so that doesn't seem to fit exactly. It is interesting to note, we've mentioned it before, that during the siege, the temple was set on fire, and the debate rages to this day whether the Jews did it or the Romans did it, but it caught on fire. The gold implements, the gold decorations melted, ran down in between the stones, and that's the reason that the soldiers took it apart stone by stone, was to recover the melted gold that was there, and that created a situation to fulfill Jesus' prediction that not one stone will be left upon another. Interesting, isn't it? So see how precise these prophecies are fulfilled. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, happened to be an eyewitness to the siege of Jerusalem. He verified that Titus leveled the city except for some of the towers of the Roman fortress Antonia. Now, Antonia was built by the Romans to keep an eye on the cantankerous Jews that were there, that were always violating or challenging Roman authority and saying, we answer to a higher authority, which they do, and we do as well. But they were trying to keep an eye on them, so they built this fort, Antonia, somewhere in that vicinity, and it's debated about where it actually was. So when we look at the western wall, which does continue to this day have stones one on top of the other, we know that Josephus was the eyewitness. He said that the walls of Antonia, some of them at least, continued to stand, and that Titus didn't destroy his own fortress. And that may give us some clues about where the original temple stood archaeologically. So we'll talk about that probably in our next session here. So Titus's abomination was not in the holy place, so I don't think this is the one that Jesus is talking about, even though it's somewhat of a candidate for it, and even though it would have been in Jesus' future, just a few decades after his death. So I'm going to reject the idea that Titus is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Jesus and also spoken of by Daniel, because those two are linked. Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Well, Titus couldn't have stood in the holy place because it would have been destroyed before he set up this altar to Jupiter. So keep that in mind. Also, we know, if we read the entire Olivet Discourse, which we'll get to in this study, the abomination is going to happen, and then a short period thereafter, we think 3.5 years, a short period thereafter, Jesus is going to return. Well, obviously, Jesus didn't return a few years after 70 AD, so that doesn't seem to fit the pattern. So I don't think it's the candidate for the abomination of desolation that we're looking for. I think it is yet to come. There could be type and archetypes or types of the archetype yet to come, but I don't believe it's happened yet. So we know that Jesus did. It has not come back yet, so it didn't happen in the first century. It hasn't happened yet. Could be soon. We'll see. Apocalypse soon. Now, this is an interesting historical note to this whole study. In 40 AD, so now we're after the time of Jesus' crucifixion, which we believe to be 32 AD, and Titus laying siege to Jerusalem in 70 AD. Right in between that, we have Caligula. And Caligula wanted to have a statue of himself erected in the Jewish temple. The temple had not been destroyed yet. And so he made plans to do this, and he ordered Petronius, that was his commander that was in Judea, he ordered him to take care of this and see that this image was erected in the temple. Well, Petronius knew good well that the Jews weren't going to put up with that. You know, he knew them well enough to know there was going to be a major revolt, and he didn't want to see that happen on his watch. So he refused to do it. So Caligula issued an order for Petronius to be put to death for insubordination to the emperor. So this order is issued from back in Rome, is making its way to Judea to be carried out, but Caligula ends up dying. Before the order can reach Judea, Caligula dies, and there's a mix-up at sea. So the ship carrying the news of Caligula's death actually got to Judea before the ship with the news of the order to execute Petronius. So as a result, Petronius was spared because of this mix-up. They didn't have email stuff. It might come as a shock to you millennials. They didn't have emails back then. And they had to deliver these messages by ship and, on foot and on horseback. And because of that, there was a delay, a divinely appointed delay, so that Petronius's life was spared because the news of Caligula's death got there first, which made the prior order null and void. So that's just an interesting historical perspective. And it could be, this is speculation on my part, but it could be that that's why God allowed the temple to be destroyed, so that another abomination of desolation could not enter into the holy place until the right time occurred, until all the pieces were in place, including the new temple being built, if our literal approach to this is correct. So let's look at Daniel chapter 12. We're going to find another reference to this abomination of desolation. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there'll be 1,290 days. Now that's almost exactly the 3.5-year period. It's off by 30 days. Not sure exactly what that other 30 days may be. There might be some speculation about that could kind of be the cleanup that takes place after Jesus returns. That added an extra 30 days on there. But it looks like there's going to be that 3.5-year period after the Antichrist abolishes the sacrifice, sets up the abomination of desolation. Then there's going to be 1,290 days. I don't think it's 1,290 days in between the two here. That doesn't seem to fit our prophetic profile or prophetic timeline here. So I just throw that out there. So midway through that 70th week, Daniel says in the middle of the week. Now, if he's going to be precise, he's been pretty precise about everything else. That means at that 3.5-year mark, that's when the sacrifices are stopped and the abomination of desolation is set up. And that's what Jesus is talking about. So he's going to stop the sacrifices, which if we take it literally probably means there needs to be a temple. There at least needs to be a tabernacle, because we're talking about the most holy place. The temple makes the most sense for a number of reasons, including the fact that the Temple Institute is moving forward to have that temple built, that third temple. So the abomination of desolation gets set up in the holy place. We've got a couple of cross references here. We just looked at Matthew 24. We'll look at 2 Thessalonians here in a bit. So that's a good place for us to stop. When we come back for the next session, I want to spend some time talking to you about this third temple. There are some conjectures about where the site of the original temple was, and we believe that in order for it to be a proper temple, it's going to have to be erected in the same exact spot. So finding out the location of the ancient temple is going to be a key to our understanding of where the third temple should go, and this is an exciting topic that's unfolding before our very eyes in the modern era. So you don't want to miss this next session.